In today's video, I'm summarizing the Federal Reserve press conference for you. So this is the meeting that ended on November 2nd, where they raised interest rates by another 0.75%. This summary will give you insights on the current status of the economy, inflation, the Fed pivot, how much they'll raise interest rates in December, and the game plan of the Federal Reserve. Of course, all of this will have consequences on the stock market, the housing market, the labor market, and the economy in general. The press conference was 45 minutes long. I'm going to be showing you 13 clips from the conference, and I have not taken anything out of context. So sometimes Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, that's going to be the person speaking, he will say some ridiculous stuff, but it will be in full context. So in total, I'm going to be showing you 7 minutes and 20 seconds of clips. I'm just going to be giving you the highlights, which means that I will be saving you 37 minutes of torture and agony. I'll be clarifying and explaining what Jerome Powell says, because a lot of times he uses technical jargon because he doesn't appear to be a man of the people. So let's get started. The first clip that I'm about to show you is a quick summary of what the Federal Reserve is doing. They decided to raise interest rates by another 0.75% at this meeting. The interest rate set by the Federal Reserve has now increased from 3.25% to 4%. Powell said the Federal Reserve will continue raising interest rates. Powell says that's the appropriate thing to do in order to get inflation down to 2%. But you have to remember that we're very far from that right now. We're at 8.2%.
Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by 75 basis points, and we continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate. We are moving our policy stance purposefully to a level that will be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%.
In this clip, Powell gives an overview of the economy. So basically the damage that higher interest rates have caused so far. Powell says that consumer spending is down because Americans have less disposable income. He says that higher interest rates are hurting the housing market and businesses are investing less money.
Growth in consumer spending has slowed from last year's rapid pace, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment.
Powell proceeds to give an overview of the situation. Powell admits that it's going to take some time for inflation to come down. But Powell says that households have a lot of money saved up. And he says that the labor market is very, very strong, very strong.
A big channel is the labor market, and the labor market is very, very strong, very strong. And households, of course, have strong balance sheets. And so we go into this with a strong labor market and excess demand in the labor market, as you can see through many different things, and also with households who have strong spending power built up. So it may take time. It may take resolve. It may take patience. It's likely to get inflation down. I think you see from our forecasts and others that it will take some time for inflation to come down. It'll take time, we think. Sorry, was I getting to your question there?
In this clip that I'm about to show you, Powell says that in order to bring down inflation, it will require that the Federal Reserve slow down the economy and increase unemployment. So he's going to say these two phrases a lot. So he's going to say below trend growth. That means to slow down the economy, and a softer labor market, which means higher unemployment. They're going to achieve this by raising interest rates. And Powell says they're going to stay the course until the job is done.
Reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices in the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done.
So listen, sooner or later, the Federal Reserve will need to stop raising interest rates. That's because it's going to cause too much economic damage. However, Powell says that now is not the time to take a pause. He says it's very premature to even talk about pausing, and interest rates need to go higher. Powell says that we have a ways to go, and he doesn't know how high interest rates need to go.
Let me say this. It is very premature to be thinking about pausing. So people, when they hear lags, they think about a pause. It's very premature, in my view, to think about or be talking about pausing our rate hike. We have a ways to go. Our policy, we need ongoing rate hikes to get to that level of sufficiently restrictive, and we don't really know exactly where that is. We have a sense.
The Federal Reserve has now raised interest rates by 0.75% 4 times in a row now. The Federal Reserve will raise interest rates again on December 14th, so that's when their next meeting is. In this clip, a reporter asks Powell about slowing down on how quickly they raise interest rates. She asks how they're going to determine whether they raise interest rates by another 0.75% or 0.5% in December. So before the December 14th meeting, we're going to see the inflation reports for October and November. So the reporter asks if their decision, 0.75% or 0.5%, will be based on those inflation reports or on other variables. You're going to hear Powell respond with the most vague answer ever. He says that he's going to take into account the full range of analysis and data guided by financial conditions, the economy, and all other financial conditions. That is just a bunch of gibberish. That's utter nonsense. So that's like saying our decisions will be based on data, like stuff. So take a listen or fast forward for a minute to save yourself from sheer nonsense.
Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. On the need to slow the pace of rate increases at some point, is a downshift contingent on a string of better inflation data specifically between now and, let's say, the December meeting? Or is that something that the Fed could potentially proceed with independent of that data, given the lagged effects that you mentioned?
So a couple things on that. We do need to see inflation coming down decisively, and good evidence of that would be a series of down monthly readings. Of course, that's what we'd all love to see, but I've never thought of that as the appropriate test for slowing the pace of increases or for identifying the appropriately restrictive level that we're aiming for. We need to bring our policy stance down to a level that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% objective over the medium term. How will we know that we've reached that level? Well, we'll take into account the full range of analysis and data that bear on that question, guided by our assessment of how much financial conditions have tightened, the effects that tightening is actually having on the real economy and on inflation, taking into consideration lags, as I mentioned. We will be looking at real rates, for example, all across the yield curve and all other financial conditions and as we make that assessment.
Okay, so if you thought that Powell's vague answer was very lame, then it's not just you and me. The next reporter was like, okay, that was confusing. Can you clarify? Does that mean that you're going to raise interest rates by 0.75% or by 0.5% in December? Start making some sense, Powell.
Hi, Howard Schneider with Reuters. Look, I'm sure there's going to be tons of confusion out there about whether this means you're going to slow in December or not. Would you say that the bias right now is not for another 75 basis point increase?
So here's what Powell says in regards to slowing down on the interest rate increases. He says that time is coming. Powell says that could happen as soon as their next meeting on December 14th or on their meeting on February 1st. He said that no decision has been made, but he said, just notice that he says that it could come as soon as those meetings. Therefore, maybe not. So this is just like a giant maybe that he says. But Powell says what's more important is how high interest rates will go and how long that they're going to stay elevated there for, rather than how quickly we're going to get there.
And that's why I've said at the last 2 press conferences that at some point it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases. So that time is coming, and it may come as soon as the next meeting or the one after that. No decision has been made. It is likely we'll have a discussion about this at the next meeting, a discussion. To be clear, let me say again, the question of when to moderate the pace of increases is now much less important than the question of how high to raise rates and how long to keep monetary policy restricted, which really will be our principal focus.
Higher interest rates hurt the economy, the stock market, the debt market, the housing market, the labor market, etc. But Powell says it's necessary to bring down inflation. A concern is that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates too fast and too high. They'll over-tighten and cause excessive economic damage. So Powell is asked about this. Powell believes that the Federal Reserve is not overdoing it. So he points out that, hey, we're still at negative real interest rates. That means that the rate of inflation is higher than the interest rate. So we have inflation at 8.2% and the interest rate at 4%. So a negative real interest rate is bad for inflation, and I'll show you how. Let's say that you put $100 in the bank, and inflation is at 8.2% and the rate of interest is at 4%. So $100 in the bank, after a year, you get $4 of interest income, right? So that's great, but inflation is running at 8.2%. So you lost $8.20 to inflation. So in this situation, you lose money. With negative real interest rates, why would you save money? It's a losing proposition. In this situation, you are encouraged to spend, 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 which fuels inflation. So Powell says, hey, we're still at negative real interest rates, which is his argument that they're not over-tightening.
Well, I think I'm pleased that we have moved as fast as we have. I don't think we've over-tightened. I think there's very difficult to make a case that our current level is too tight, given that inflation still runs well above the federal funds rate. So I think that at this meeting, the last two meetings, as I've mentioned, I've said that there would come a point, and this was a meeting at which we had a discussion about what that might mean, and we did discuss this, and as I mentioned, we'll discuss it again in December. But there's I don't have any sense that we've over-tightened or moved too fast. I think it's been good and a successful program. That we've gotten this far this fast. Remember though that we still think there's a need for ongoing rate increases, and we have some ground left to cover here, and cover it we will.
In this clip, Powell says that he would rather over-tighten than do the opposite. So you have to remember that over-tightening means raising interest rates higher than they should have gone, which would hurt the economy more than was necessary. So Powell says not raising interest rates enough would be more dangerous because that would lead to long-lasting inflation, entrenched inflation. Powell also says if the Federal Reserve does raise interest rates higher than necessary and cripples the economy, they could always just print more money and cut interest rates to fix it.
You know, if we were to over-tighten, we could then use our tools strongly to support the economy. Whereas if we don't get inflation under control because we don't tighten enough, now we're in a situation where inflation will become entrenched, and the costs, the employment costs in particular, will be much higher potentially. So from a risk management standpoint, we want to be sure that we don't make the mistake of either failing to tighten enough or loosening policy too soon.
In this clip, Powell says again, if the Federal Reserve over-tightens, they could print more money like they did in 2020 and 2021. So I know what you're thinking. If they did that, that would just cause more inflation. And you know what? You are absolutely right. If they do that again, we'll probably have hyperinflation by that point. But Powell plays it off like, hey, it's no big deal. Like, we'll just print more money. It's just a short-term mentality type of thing. I guess we're just living in the now.
If we over-tighten, then we have the ability with our tools, which are powerful, to, as we showed at the beginning of the pandemic episode, we can support economic activity strongly if that happens, if that's necessary. On the other hand, if you make the mistake in the other direction and you let this drag on, then it's a year or two down the road and you're realizing inflation behaving the way it can, you're realizing that you didn't actually get it, you have to go back in. By then, the risk really is that it has become entrenched in people's thinking.
In this clip, Powell is asked if we can still avoid a recession. Powell responds, it's possible, but it's not looking good. Powell says that interest rates need to go higher and they need to stay higher than originally thought. He says that in that type of environment, it's going to be hard to avoid a recession.
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer from Marketplace. I'm wondering, has the window for a soft landing narrowed? Do you still think it's possible?
Has it narrowed? Yes. Is it still possible? Yes. I think we've always said it was going to be difficult, but I think to the extent rates have to go higher and stay higher for longer, it becomes harder to to see the path, it's narrowed. I would say the path has narrowed over the course of the last year, really.
The same reporter follows up and she asks, why is it now less likely that we can avoid a recession? Powell responds, because inflation is not coming down. Powell expected inflation to come down by now, so he was wrong again. Because inflation is not coming down, the Federal Reserve needs to raise interest rates higher and keep them higher for longer, which is going to damage the economy. So with that being said, the path for a soft landing has narrowed.
But just real quickly, why do you feel like the window has narrowed?
Because we haven't seen inflation coming down. The implication of inflation not coming down, and what we would expect by now to have seen is that as the supply side problems had resolved themselves, we would have expected goods inflation to come down by now, long since by now, and it really hasn't. Although it has come down, but it's not to the extent we had hoped.
I hope this video has been helpful. Please subscribe. I'll keep you updated. I'll save you the time. Thank you for the support, and I wish you a very nice day.